All right, welcome back to another stream analyzing the unknown reality. We had some technical stream that happens every once in a blue moon. There's a connection issue, but I know exactly where we left off, so give me a moment to get everything set back up perfectly, and we will start again. We shall resume. So one moment. So one moment. Good. Sound is good. So yeah, we were almost to the end of the 690th session. I'm almost wondering if I should change the title or should have changed the title, but I did not. So I guess technically, well, I guess I probably shouldn't, because technically there's still some more left. And give me just a moment here and we'll get right back to it. I already tweeted the other one. We'll just leave it at that, I guess. Okay, without further ado, let us resume. There are no closed systems, and in deep biological orders, each species knows what another is doing, and its place in the overall scheme that has been chosen by each. You, underlined, are perceived in one way or another by all those inhabitants of Earth you may consider beneath you. Probable man is emerging now, but also in relationship with his entire natural environment, in which cooperation is a main force. You are cooperating with nature whether or not you realize it, for you, underlined, are a part of it. End of dictation. Pause at 11:42. Give us a moment. Seth now delivered a paragraph of material for Jane and me. End of session, and my heartiest regards. A fond good evening. Thank you, Seth. Good night. 11:44 p.m. Jane had been really out. And as I mentioned, that does indeed now conclude that session. So that was some good, interesting stuff, wasn't it? That was deeply fascinating. I love this material so much. I can just never get enough of it. Never get enough of knowledge in general, in fact. So let's take a little breather between sessions. And then we shall resume. So maybe we shouldn't take too much of a breather since we just had the technical interruption. So I will simply say again, sorry for my messed up hair tonight. I got caught in the wind and rain earlier, multiple times actually today, and so it's just kind of, not really itself. It looked much better earlier, I promise, before it got messed up. Session 691, March 25th, 1974, 9:35 p.m., Monday. Well, that's almost the time it is right now as I'm broadcasting. This is 9:19 p.m. here. It's like, and it's a Monday night, so it's like almost, what's the word I'm looking for? Like meta, or like, I don't know. There's another word. Can't think of it. Anyway. Neither Jane nor I could remember what last Thursday's session was about, and I had but one page of it typed from my notes, a situation quite similar to that prevailing before the last session. We were ready this evening by 9:20. At 9:30, Jane said she was starting to get quote-unquote bleed-throughs about Seth's material for tonight. Ah, Lumen, welcome back. Yes, we had some technical difficulties, as happens once in a blue moon, but we are back now. And we're just beginning this next session. You didn't really miss anything. Also here, showed this earlier, but I'll show it again. Behold my heart monitor. My heart is being monitored right now as we speak. It's being monitored live. Or, well, you know what I mean. I have to wear this for 24 hours. I'm wired up. Yeah, the Holter heart monitor. Yep. I'm wired up for 24 hours so they can see what my heart's doing. So, all right, let's resume. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Now, dictation. And can't you do something about this? Seth indicated Jane's bangs, which were close to hanging over her eyes. I'd been meaning to trim them. Yes. Amused. A word to the wise. It's kind of funny. Wow, that's almost another thing that sort of have in common here. It's like, my bangs were any longer, they'd be in my eyes. That's funny. So wait, so Seth was like, and can't you do something about this? And then he pointed to Jane's bangs hanging over her eyes. Then Rob was like, yes. And then Seth, in an amused tone, said, a word to the wise. Oh my. They had like a little sitcom going there or something. So anyway. Your particular society has set up such an artificial division between intuitional and intellectual knowledge that only the intellectually apparent is given credence. With all of their dire faults and distortions, religions have at least kept alive the idea of unseen, valid worlds and given some affirmation to concepts that are literally known by the cells, period. The conscious mind has always been aware of the cells. At 9:39, the telephone began to ring insistently. I answered it while Jane came out of trance. The call was a follow-up to a long-distance one she'd taken shortly after supper tonight, and concerned a missing person and a government agency. No other details need be given here, except to say that the case was a complex one. Although she doesn't usually do such work because of the time required, as well as her own emotional attitudes, Jane had given impressions during the earlier call. She was told now that those impressions had checked out very well, so, in an exchange that lasted for 3/4 of an hour, she gave more such information. She finished with the tentative understanding that by midnight she'd receive another call, after there had been time to check her second set of impressions. Jane laughingly told me that if the new data, quote-unquote, wasn't good enough, she'd probably never again hear from the people involved, but at this time we didn't realize what was to follow. Ooh, how exciting. Jane is like literally psychically assisting a government agency, apparently, or was at this time. Fascinating. I read her the material that Seth had given so far this evening. At 10:30, she resumed the session as though there hadn't been any interruption at all. Comprehension, period. Okay, so since, yeah, super Jane, yeah, indeed, right? So since that sentence was interrupted by the break, I will read the sentence as if it was not interrupted. So it would say, the conscious mind has always been aware of the cell's comprehension, period. The invisible reality within the cell is what gives it its structure. The remarkable organization of the body in terms of its learning abilities and adaptability will never be understood unless the cell's precognitive comprehension is taken into consideration. Footnote. Quote unquote, the cells precognate. See the 684th session with its note 2 in section 1. End of footnote. This precognitive ability steers the cell through mazes of probabilities while allowing it to retain knowledge of its own greatest fulfillment, underlined the idea of itself, which is always alive in any given period of your time. On a different kind of scale, then, each individual has the same sort of idealized version of the self, and so does each species. Here I mean underlined each species, and I am not simply referring to mankind. Obviously, these are not apparent to the physical senses, yet they are strong energy centers that to some degree do stimulate the physical senses toward activity. To underline that degree, then, there are indeed quote unquote tree gods, gods of the forest, and quote unquote gods of being connected with each person. Angels have been represented in just this fashion. At one time, there were also species of birds, however, with high intelligence. This before the period mentioned earlier. Footnote. The time span Seth referred to here existed 30 million to 50 million years ago, he told us in the 689th session, and fell within the Tertiary period. How long before that period had the intelligent birds lived? I wasn't quick enough to ask him. I didn't remember the details in the 689th session well enough. End of footnote. They were not humanoid, not, for example, people with wings. They were large birds, with a capacity for dealing with concepts. They were social, could swim well, pause, and for some time could live on the water. They had songs of great beauty and a most extensive vocabulary. They had talons. Parentheses, her eyes wide and dark, Jane held up her hands, fingers bent as though ready to grasp or claw. So Seth was speaking through Jane, saying they had talons, and Jane's like holding her hands up like a talon or a claw. I'm not quite sure how that would be. Something like this, probably. The forest children, lol. Yes, indeed. When he was a cave dweller, man saw these birds often, particularly in cliffs by water. Footnote. Nor was I quick enough to ask Seth if the material Jane delivered for him tonight constituted any kind of contradiction with that of the 689th session, for in that session he discussed man-animal and animal-man as existing within the Tertiary period. Presumably, these quote-unquote mutated forms had implied the beginnings of man, in ordinary terms, yet now Seth spoke of cave-dwelling humans as coexistent with large birds at an earlier time. Had Jane distorted information in one session or the other? Was it possible that during the complicated rhythms of history, man could have been man, at least approximately as we know him, even before the Tertiary period, then moved into a long cycle of animal man forms before returning to being man again? In tonight's session, had Jane tuned into data on a parallel or probable reality, for example? Too involved to determine these questions on too little material. End of footnote. Many times the birds saved children from falling. Man identified with their easy flight up the cliffsides and followed the sounds of their songs to safe clearings. These memories turned into the angel images. In each case, in those times, there was the greatest cooperation on a global scale between species. The inner impetus toward development, however, came from the innate comprehension of future probabilities. In that picture, all species alive at any time joined. This included plants and fauna. Those who cooperated survived, but they did not think in terms of the survival of their own species alone, but in time terms of a greater living picture, or world inviolate, in which underlined all survived. There are various orders of existence even within your system itself. You merely focus upon the one to which you are oriented. There underlined are, then, quote-unquote, spirits of all natural things. But unfortunately, even when you consider such possibilities, you project your own religious ideas of good and evil upon them. You may simply dismiss such concepts as silly, for they seem intellectually scandalous to many. If you do entertain yourself, you must often personify such spirits, projecting upon them your own ideas of personhood. Instead, you should think of them as different kinds or orders of species that are connected with all natural living things. They certainly have a reality in energy, and they aid in the conversion of energy in physical terms. They are active rather than passive, then. You see about you physical forces, for example, feel the wind and its effects, but you cannot see underlined it. The wind itself is invisible, so these other forces are also invisible. In basic terms, they are no more good or evil than the wind is. A countering force that is evil. Such is not the case. In greater terms, these forces are underlined good. They are protective. They nourish every living thing. They have been the impetus for what you underlined think of as evolution. They are biological in that they are to some extent composed of vast cellular knowledge, basically free of time, but underlined directing physical activity in time, and thereby maintaining physical equilibrium. Now I sip some tea. So the spirits of the forest, Seth says, are indeed. Reminds me of the song In Perfect Harmony by Within Temptation. It's a good song. There is great cooperation, again, between such forces. In such a way, one tree in a forest knows of the entire environment and its relationship in it. Its underlined tree-ness can merge with soilness, for example. 11:02. Again, the telephone began to ring. It was the expected, if somewhat early, third call in the series already described. While Jane was coming out of trance once more, the caller told me about being quote-unquote impressed by her abilities, and, I thought privately, considerably surprised. When Jane came to the phone, she was informed that insofar as it was possible to verify her earlier data, practically all of it had been correct. Encouraged, she now gave additional impressions. These were more specific and personal. By the time she was finished, it was 11:38. So the government called for Jane again, and she gave her information. Fascinating. You'll listen to that, Lumen? Awesome. I hope you like it. I know I sure do. It's from Within Temptation's Mother Earth album, one of the best albums I've ever heard. I suggested that she end the session, but she decided to sit for it again to quote-unquote see what happens. So a minute later, now, a bit more dictation. Pause. Because you are people, you personify what you perceive, quote-unquote peopleize it. You imagine such quote-unquote spirits to be small people, endowed with your own kind of characteristics. Instead, there are simply underlined species of consciousness, entirely different from your own, not usually perceived physically under most conditions. They are indeed connected with flora and fauna, but also with the animals and yourselves, and they are the quote-unquote earth gods that Rupert imagined as a young person. Ooh, this is interesting. You each have your own earth god. The term may not be the best, but it is meant to express that portion of you that is as yet unexpressed in your terms, the idealized, underlined earth version of yourself, which you are becoming. The idealized earth version is not meant to mean a perfect self in flesh at all. Instead, it represents a psychic reality in which your own abilities fulfill themselves in relationship with your earthly environment to the fullest extent possible, within the time and place you have already chosen. That earth god portion of yourself attempts to direct you through probabilities, again, on deep biological levels beneath normal consciousness, and on psychic levels above normal consciousness. You are aware of the integrity of your being, but also of your great connection, while living in flesh, with the natural environment of time and space. The earth god concept can be consciously used, but only to your greatest advantage if you understand the purposes of your conscious mind and its relationship with your biological nature. Your conscious mind tells you where you are in time and space, and directs your activity in a world of human action. That world has its own kind of rich complication that is as unknown to the animals as is much of their acute realization unknown to you. Because you have a conscious mind, then, other portions of your being rely upon it to give them an adequate picture of your situation and to give the conscious orders for action. These orders will then be carried out. To do this, you must use that mind as completely as possible. The picture of reality in underlined time and space that you give to your cells must be accurate. They must act on a minute to minute, second to second, microsecond to microsecond basis, even though their own orientation is underlined not familiar with your time concept. End of dictation. Heartily. Short break. Then a few remarks, if you're up to it. Okay. 12:18. Jane's trance had been excellent, her delivery strong and sure. And since we decided that we were up to it, Seth returned in a quarter of an hour with better than 2 pages of material for Jane and me. The session was finally over, then, at 12:50 a.m. All right, so that's the end of that session, and we shall blast right on into the next session in just a moment. Session 692, which, here, let me just give you a quick preview of what it will be about. Session 692, for it says simultaneous dreams, unused areas of the brain. So like simultaneous dreams, maybe like some shared dreaming we're about to get into. Excellent. Queen of Pentacles picture, that's ironic. How about a tarot card? Oh yeah, Queen of Pentacles, like earth spirit or one's earth god or earth goddess, perhaps. Real quick, let me say this. So recently, I've been trying this whole new thing with reading tarot cards for myself, at least, where, so there seem to be two conflicting schools of thought when it comes to tarot. One says that you should always stick with the official traditional meanings of the cards. The other says basically figure out what each card means to you and don't even worry about the official traditional meanings. And I guess there's a third school of thought that says do both or use both. Well, up until just recently, I hadn't really tried just sort of figuring out what each card means to me in readings, but I tried that recently, and let me tell you guys, wow, that breathed new life and deliciousness and excitement and fascination into doing tarot readings for myself that I haven't felt in like forever. It was so good. And I remember the Queen of Pentacles was indeed one of those cards that came up when I did one of those readings. And I just sort of got a feel for it, for like what it like felt like to me and what it meant to me. And boy, all I can say is if you read tarot cards and you haven't tried that, I highly recommend it. Like, it brings the cards to life in a whole new way. Like, I still highly recommend looking at the official meanings too, but wow, like just kind of intuitively feeling them out and applying that to the reading. It's so good. It's so delicious. I absolutely love it. And I saw new things too. I saw things I never saw before and like got answers I never got before from doing readings like that. Like, it's so good. I know, right? I remember that feeling, like to tell a story with the cards. Yeah. Yes, you know what I'm talking about. You remember that feeling? Yeah. Oh God, it's just so good. I love it. Honestly, I feel like I could sit here just doing tarot readings for myself on various subjects all day and all night, all day, every day, probably, if I wanted to. It's so delicious. But anyway, so now let us resume. I have almost an hour left. Let us resume with session 692. Session 692, April 24th, 1974, 10:03 p.m., Wednesday. See Appendix 10 for a summary of Jane's psychic work in connection with, quote, the affair of the missing person, end quote, as we came to call it. She first encountered the event on the evening, I think it's supposed to say of the last session, the 691st, or no. She first encountered the event on the evening the last session, the 691st, was held. I've added a few quotes from Jane and Seth to the appendix material. On Wednesday, March 27th, we received from Jane's publisher the page proofs for Seth's second book, The Nature of Personal Reality, a Seth book. Footnote. See Note 1 for session 682. End of footnote. No session was held that night. Actually, correcting the proofs, carefully scrutinizing well over 500 printed pages word by word, checking and rechecking notes, spelling, punctuation, and so forth, kept us so busy that we suspended the next 8 scheduled sessions, covering a period of 26 days. Ordinarily, Seth would have used those sessions to deliver work on unknown reality. We disliked interrupting our creative rhythms in that fashion, although in the meantime, Jane kept ESP class going as usual, coming through as Seth and as Sumari within that context. And we told ourselves that Seth was perfectly capable of resuming work on unknown reality whenever we were ready to do so, whether the time lapse involved 1 week or 6 months. Such was the case, of course. And once again, Seth used a quote-unquote fresh event, a dream experience of mine that transpired on the third night following the last session, as a basis for his book dictation tonight. On Friday morning, March 29th, I told Jane that sometime during the previous night I had awakened with the certain knowledge that I'd just finished having 2 dreams at once. I retained conscious memory of one of them for just a moment before it irrevocably faded. Neither Jane nor I remembered hearing of or experiencing what I'll call double dreaming. I wrote an account of the phenomenon while wondering if I'd distorted some quite ordinary dream happening, and while knowing at the same time that I hadn't. I decided to ask Seth to discuss the 2 dreams when we went back to having sessions again, then forgot about them until I got around to rereading my first rough version of these notes last week. In brackets, it says, when Seth discusses my quote-unquote dreams in this session, however, it turns out that from his perspective, he's able to be more accurate about labeling them than I was. Before finishing the notes, I thought of asking a few other people if they had either heard of double dreaming or had experienced it. The first person I talked to was our friend Sue Watkins, who has attended ESP class almost from the time Jane started it in 1967. I was more than a little surprised when Sue said that she'd enjoyed such events several times. Jane and I have known Sue since 1965, yet as far as any of us could remember, and for whatever reasons, the subject of double dreaming had never been discussed among us. But not only had she done it more than once, Sue said, she could recall portions of the simultaneous dreams she'd had on some of those occasions, which was a lot more than I could claim. Grinning, she proceeded to confound me further by describing the double dreams of another class member, since, obviously, the individual in question had also had certain dream adventures that Jane and I didn't know about. I ended up thinking that my own little experience hadn't amounted to so much after all, but still, it had made Jane and me aware of another facet of dream life. See Note 2 for any other information on double dreams that I may assemble, as well as for an excerpt from the description Sue wrote, at my request, of a multiple dream happening of her own. Dreaming 2 at once led me to write down a second question for Seth. I wanted him to enlarge upon the statement he'd made at 11:29 in the 690th session. Quote, further developments in your concepts will lead to greater activation in portions of the brain now not nearly utilized, and these in turn will trigger expansions in both psychic and biological terms. End quote. I wondered what connection, if any, might exist between the capacity to have, and or to remember, more than one dream at a time, and those, quote, portions of the brain now not nearly utilized, end quote. I read my 2 questions to Jane as we waited for tonight's session to begin. She listened carefully, then said that, quote, there's something there on the dreams, end quote, meaning that Seth was around, was aware of our conversation, and would probably comment. Actually, Jane had grown very relaxed since supper time, so much so that she'd considered skipping the session. She decided not to because of the time we'd missed lately. We waited. Jane sipped from a glass of wine. Then, taking off her glasses, she was in trance. All right, so the official session is about to begin. And I'm reading the comments. That's interesting. Like you can like feel directions around the elements. Fascinating. I think there's also, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think there's also like supposed to be like official yeah, I think there is like supposed to be like official associations of directions with each element, but I can't remember which direction is which element. You have to eventually mix elements pretty naturally, by the way. Imagine all the dots. Yeah, the Celtic cross spread is, man, there is so much that you can figure out from that spread. It's crazy. I'm sure there's so much about it that even I don't know, even after, using it all the time for like 3 years. Oh, by the way, I believe this is my first stream with my Full Metal Alchemist mug. You can see there, it says Full Metal, and over there it says Alchemist, but it's kind of hard to show it like that. There we go. Which I just got recently, and I'm wearing a shirt of that too. You gods, people probably think I'm obsessed, crazy about that show. Maybe I am a little bit. All right. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Now, to begin with your dream, the entity is aware of the experiences of all of its personalities. Give us a moment. To the entity, your own consciousness could be likened to one stream of consciousness in your terms. The greater part of your own identity, then, is completely aware of all of your conscious and unconscious living material. It is also aware of the same kind of data from all of its and your parts. Because you identify your experience with the regular line of consciousness with which you are familiar, you are rarely able to, quote-unquote, bring in any, quote-unquote, other self material and hold it while retaining your own sense of identity. Such material may at times bleed or intrude into your own thought, where it blends and is not recognized. In such cases, it takes on the coloration of your own thought patterns. It adds to the overall atmosphere of your being. Without understanding or training, you would have to, quote-unquote, lose your own consciousness in order to perceive the, quote-unquote, other consciousness. There is a correlation here with something Rupert said in brackets ESP class last evening. He said that writing underlined can be, first, a method of standing apart from life to some extent in order to underlined capture life and preserve the unutterable uniqueness of any given day. But, he said, you can then discover that the writing itself becomes the day's experience. You are then, quote-unquote, lost in the writing as much as you feared being lost in normal living, with no way to step aside and view the experience. My addition, now, to those remarks is this. You would need the creation then of another, quote-unquote, self, who stood aside from the writing self in order to preserve the original underlined intent. Now, in the same way you could not, practically speaking, experience such other consciousness, with a hyphen, that's other hyphen consciousness, unless you learn to stand somewhat aside, like the writer in Rupert's remarks. Period. But even if you did, the very experience of other consciousness itself would supersede your living space. You would need another self, able to hold both lines of consciousness at once, lost in neither but maintaining footing in each. This would be a very difficult achievement in normal life in any underlined sustained fashion. Now, in the dream state, your specialized focus need not be as precise or time-oriented as in the waking state. 1020. In your case, you did perform an excellent accomplishment. You, underlined, were aware of the simultaneous dreams, each being experienced in alternate realities. You could not at this point remember both dreams, because the physical brain apparatus could not handle the simultaneous data. This has reference to portions of the brain not used, as mentioned in this book. Footnote. Refer to the second of my questions in the opening notes for this session, and note 2 for session 687. End of footnote. At certain levels, the brain can handle simultaneous material, of course, even though you may be conscious of only a smattering of it. The body is aware of multitudinous simultaneous stimuli that consciously escape you, and is able to act on the information. This includes all kinds of sense data that are not consciously pertinent. Intently. Because of the particular kind of ego orientation that the race decided upon, however, many probabilities of development inherent in the species have been latent. Inherently, the physical brain underlined is capable of dealing with more than one main line of consciousness. This does not mean the development of dual personality, by the way. It means the further expansion of the concept of identity. Quote unquote, you would not only be aware of the you that you have always known in the same way that you are now, but a deeper sense of identity would also arise. Underlined, that identity would contain the you that you have always known and in no way threaten it. The new you would simply be more than you are now. You would just have another expansion of consciousness, another self who is aware of being, in the same way that, using an analogy, granted, the writer is aware of the self who lives. In those terms, underlined is the self who lives while being in a position of some apartness, able to comment upon the life being lived. Now, in a very small way, admittedly, that analogy hints at the kind of deeper events that occur as selves are born out of selves to operate in various levels of activity. In the case of entities, each such self dwells underlined entirely in its own dimension or system of reality. To me, you underlined are, in a rudimentary fashion, beginning to open up those unused areas of the brain, or you would not have even been aware of the fact of two simultaneous dreams. Language and your verbal thought patterns make such translations highly difficult, however, even in the best of circumstances. A multilingual individual, in that regard at least, underlined might have some idea of how concepts are structured through verbal pattern, and hence possess some additional freedom in such translations, provided, of course, that he or she was aware of the possibilities to begin with. Now, one experience was a dream of your own, in usual terms. The other quote-unquote dream experience simultaneously was, instead, your muddled interpretation of vital experienced reality on the part of another portion of yourself, in another reality entirely, a dimensional bleed-through. Once you are aware of such experience, most likely you will also have others in quote-unquote your dream state. Now, take a break or end the session as you prefer. Let's take a break then. 10:43. Jane took a few moments to come out of a deep trance. Her delivery had been steady, almost fast. I have a pretty good idea of what was said, she told me. And just before the session, I knew what Seth would say about your dream experience. Not that I could tell you now what he did say, but still I contained that knowledge somehow. She also knew that the dream event tied in with my question about the quote-unquote unused portions of the brain. Jane was still very relaxed, so I asked her again if she wanted Seth to say something about her state. She decided to see what developed. Her head kept dipping down. She yawned, blinking. Her hands, she said, felt, quote-unquote, like water. At times, such signs have marked the beginning of a pronounced altered state of consciousness for her, but she added that she wasn't going into, quote, a psychedelic experience, end quote, now. All right. You like my mug? Thank you. I enjoy it immensely. My mom got it for me and took me completely by surprise. Getting a Full Metal Alchemist mug was like the farthest thing from my mind, and there it was, and I'm like, thank you so much. All right. Resume at 10:59. Now, quietly. In the waking state, you would find such an experience highly threatening without some suitable preparation, and I must be very cautious in my treatment of your concepts of the self and underlined your ideas of one personhood. Footnote. See the 683rd session up to the first break. End of footnote. I am not speaking of you personally, Joseph, so much as I am emphasizing that the race at present identifies its individual being with highly limited concepts of the self. Those ideas are vigorously protected, and indeed must be understood, underlined, and given honor even while attempts are made to expand them. Period. Certainly the quality of consciousness has changed through the centuries in many different ways, and sometimes in what would appear to be contradictory ones. But in your present, you have nothing against which to compare your current consciousness of experience. To a very limited extent, the different civilizations and cultures with which you are historically familiar represent a dim glimmering of the various qualities of consciousness and their varieties of experience. But as there are physical species, so there are what you may call underlined species of consciousness also, intently. Footnote. Seth's first use of species of consciousness came after 1138 in the last session, and added later. He comes up with another evocative phrase, civilizations of the psyche, in the 715th session in Volume 2 of Unknown Reality. Much of that session can be taken as an extension of his material here on the qualities of consciousness that have existed on the earth. In the 715th session, Seth also lets fall some rather humorous comments on Jane's own mixed reactions when she first encountered such hints of the, quote, multidimensionality of your beings, end quote. End of footnote. 1108. There are even now in your underlined species a number of different kinds of consciousness, different in that the physical life situation is qualitatively experienced in ways that are not native to you and your culture, different in that the underlined entire fabric of meaning, interpretation, experience, and life itself is quote unquote alien to the kind of experience with which you are familiar. This does not mean that such differences occur as the underlined result of the cultural backgrounds or situations, for some such individuals exist within your own culture, and some with your kind of consciousness exist in cultures where they are a minority. I am simply saying that on your earth now there are species of consciousness, though that is probably not the best term. You have been so obsessed with exterior differences, especially of color and nationality, that you have completely ignored these other far more important variations in the underlined form that consciousness takes in relation to physical life within your race, the race of man. Pause at 11:15. In terms of your personal experience, the Sumari is a case in point. Footnote. See Appendix 9 with its notes 2 and 3. End of footnote. The members of each quote-unquote species, and you had better put that in quotes, of consciousness relate to physical experience in their characteristic ways, even viewing time, space, and action differently. They orient to their bodies in their own particular manners. Each group does possess a different relationship with the body, with nature, and with the world in general. Give us a moment. Still in trance, Jane lit a cigarette. Your stratified concepts of one personhood overlook all such inherent differences, however, and you have a tendency to transpose your own concepts whenever you come in contact with those whose ideas you cannot understand. Even now in some quote-unquote tribal societies, for example, the self underlined is experienced far differently, so that, while so-called individuality as you understand it is maintained, each self is also experienced as a part of others in the tribe, and the natural environment. To some, this seems to mean that individuality is stillborn or undeveloped. You protect your ideas of selfhood at all costs, even against the evidence of nature, which shows you that all are related. Uniqueness, private experience, and individuality attain their dimensions of being and their true grandeur only when the inherent relationships among all elements of being are understood. You fight against your own greater individuality and the spacious dimensions of your own being when you overprotect your underlined ideas of selfhood by limiting the experience of the self. Now, that is the end of the session. My heartiest regards to you both. Okay, good night, Seth. 11:29 p.m. Jane had really been under. Boy, I was getting that stuff through clear as a bell, she said finally. But then it stopped and the session was over all at once. Her very enjoyable state of relaxation continued. And that concludes that session. All right, well, we are just making all kinds of progress tonight, aren't we? I literally still have some time left, and so we'll just go right on into session 693 in just a moment. First, let's see what it's about. Session 693 is about quote-unquote coincidences, moving, and probable realities, a tale of probable real estate events. Oh boy, got some fourth house activity up in this unknown reality. All right, so I think I'm gonna hang on, let me read the comments. Not to outdo you, I got a set with a coffee press for Mother's Day. Oh, nice. Made of clear glass, really cute. Collect cups. Mother ducker. Oh, that's cool. A set with coffee press made of clear glass for Mother's Day. Oh, that's good. Well, happy belated Mother's Day to you and all the mothers out there. You know, I thought on Mother's Day of maybe tweeting Happy Mother's Day to the night mother, but I wasn't sure if I should do that or not, and so I didn't do it. I probably should have. Maybe I should have said, on behalf of my current character in Oblivion, Evocar Daemone, I would like to wish the night mother a happy Mother's Day. Would have been rather fitting, I think. Why not? Indeed, why not? I don't know why. I think I was just I don't know, I was doing one thing after another, and I kind of I felt short on time. Oh, well, there's always next year. There's always next year. So I think I'm going to update the title of this stream real quick, as long as we're, blasting into additional sessions, so that we have the appropriate session numbers. Let's see here. Hang on. You kissed her off. I'll just show you. Oh, geez. Yeah, not an ideal thing with the night mother, from what I can see. Unless perhaps your name is Cicero. Well, anyone who's played Skyrim will know what I mean, probably. Huh. That's interesting. According to the information in front of me, the stream earlier that got cut off but is now up on my channel has gotten some views while this one has continued. People are watching that when I'm live with a new one, but not that I mind. It's just kind of funny. Interesting. All right, so yeah, just give me a moment, please. We're gonna say that this is 690 to 693. And hang on. Maybe instead of sex, the gods, and the ego, I should put sex, the gods, and dreaming or something. Hang on. I think I'll put I guess that'll work. Sex, the gods, and dreaming. Maybe I'll change it again later. Who knows? Just want to make it somewhat accurate while I'm live. So, like, if people see it, they'll have somewhat of an idea of what to expect. Although now we're probably going to get into other material anyway, so maybe it doesn't really matter. But oh well, whatever. That's that's funny. I don't know what to say, but that's funny. All right. So, session 693. It's funny also, like right now, I've been awake all day. I've been awake since like 8 a.m. because I had to get up early to go to the hospital for the test, and then I had therapy and everything. But I don't feel tired yet, and it's like 10:06 p.m. here. I don't feel tired. In fact, I feel like I could go eat and then come back later, but I probably won't. I probably will be tired by then, sadly. But right now, I feel like I could keep going like almost all night or something. Who knows? We'll see. Maybe I'll get a burst of energy and stay on late into the night. Oh God, my hair's so terrible. Again, as I mentioned earlier, my hair is terrible tonight because I got caught in the wind and rain earlier during my various rendezvous that I just mentioned. So it just has to kind of be what it is. All right. Session 693, April 29th, 1974, 9:45 p.m., Monday. Just before she went into trance, Jane said to me, "I've got something fascinating for you." And then Seth began with, as usual, "Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Now, give us a moment. In one way or another throughout this book, we will be dealing with history as you know it and as you do not know it. We will be discussing it in terms of the quote-unquote past of your species. In many ways, history is your built-in past, the obvious events that are significant, all of the different variations that can be played upon human consciousness, all of the racial probabilities, are in one way occurring in ages past, but they are also happening in what you think of as your present. As mentioned earlier, in sessions 680 through 82, your consciousness seizes upon certain events over others and brings these into significance, and therefore into the official reality that you know. New paragraph. Even in your private lives, however, there are clues as to other kinds of sequences in which events can occur, and underlined do. You are usually unaware of the significance of such hints. They pass beneath your notice simply because they do not fit the ordered sequence with which you are familiar. In your idea of reality, such clues appear underlined insignificant. They make no sense, particularly in the ordered scheme of reality generally recognized. Your cellular structure underlined is innately able to follow such sequences. Believing such clues to be meaningless, the conscious mind does not perceive them or calls them coincidences. Such clues in your intimate daily life, however, looked at in a different way, can tell you much about the potentials of the species and give you glimpses of other systems of reality in which human consciousness can respond. I am here using an incident from the experience of Rupert and Joseph, but the reader can make his or her own correlations and discover like events from which the same conclusions can be drawn. New paragraph. Driving through Sayre, Pennsylvania, one Sunday afternoon, Joseph noticed a house for sale in a neighborhood he knew, and remembered that it had belonged, in his memory, to a man of whom his mother had been fond. On impulse, Joseph had Rupert call the real estate firm whose sign was on the house. Oh, wait, I almost missed a footnote. Jane and I took our drive 3 weeks ago on April 7th. The town of Sayre is only 18 miles from Elmira, New York, where we live now, and it sits in the beautiful Pennsylvania hills between two smaller communities, Athens to the south and Waverly to the north in New York State. Locally, the three are known as the Valley. We visit Sayre occasionally. Although it's close by far as miles go, for me, important aspects of it are far away in terms of years. End of footnote. So let me just see something rather interesting real quick. Since I am from Pennsylvania, Okay, Google. How far is Sayre, Pennsylvania from here?
You are 202 miles away from Sayre on foot.
On foot. That's weird. 202 miles. Okay, fascinating. But that's on foot. But I guess it would be similar by car or whatever. We don't need to get into the details. But so that would take a number of hours to drive, I guess, most likely. How about in a car? Yeah. Well, I mean, if you really want me to, I can look that up too. But that was on foot for some reason. Jeez. Must have been like I must have set something to like how far is this on via walking on Google Maps a while back and it retained the setting. But oh well. It's the same no matter what you take. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think there might be slight variations, is what I'm thinking. Obviously, it's going to be similar, but I think there might be slight variations because I've seen like it'll alter the route that it recommends for walking than the route it recommends for driving. But then again, I'm not even familiar with what route that would be, so maybe it would be the same in this case. All right, so let's see. Where were we? So on impulse, Joseph and Rupert called a real estate firm whose sign was on the house. The house was still owned by the man in question. Joseph only remembered his mother speaking of this gentleman in the past. In the recognized reality shared by the Butts family, there had been no intimate contact between Joseph's mother and Mr. Markle, as I'll call him. I think that might be Rob, who wrote that in parentheses, saying as he'll call him. Joseph's mother had been greatly struck by the man, however, and was convinced that she underlined could have married him instead of the husband she had chosen. Ooh, what a conclusion to make. Through the years, she fantasized such a situation. It gets even better. Mr. Markle was and is wealthy. Now, of course, he is an old man, unable to tend to his home any longer. He is now in a home for the aged, but well cared for. Joseph felt strong leanings toward Mr. Markle's home. Though the price was quite high, Rupert and Joseph thought about buying it and were taken through the home by the real estate people. A coincidence, a mere trick of fate that Joseph could be walking through the old man's home, and that Mr. Markle would be spending his last time in a nursing home, as had Joseph's mother. Meaningless but evocative that this house was for sale, and that the old man was insisting upon a price higher than the house is worth, just as Joseph's mother insisted upon a high price for her own home, and determined to get it. Period. Footnote. The quote-unquote real estate people who showed Jane and me through the Markle place last Thursday, April 25th, are a husband and wife team who operate a small real estate and insurance agency in Sayre. We like the Johnsons, although that isn't their real name, at once. Going through Mr. Markle's house was quite an experience. Certainly I hadn't expected to find myself doing so now, some 43 years after the last time I'd been in it. Jane wasn't attracted to it as much as I was, of course, so that knowledge helped keep my own enthusiasm in check. From my grade school days, I thought I remembered the house's large living room especially, for the Markles had raised two children who were contemporary with my next youngest brother and me. Sometimes the four of us met at the house, then went to school together. End of footnote. Footnote. Not only did my mother insist, quote, upon a high price for her own home, end quote, but to the surprise of everyone involved in the sale, family members, real estate agents, and others, she succeeded in getting it. End of footnote. That is how it looked from the outside. It appeared to be one of life's curious incidents. 10:12. Instead, you have a rich interweaving of probabilities, for in one probability the two were indeed married, and underlined that Stella, brackets, Butts, saw the house go to the eldest son, parentheses, myself. In underlined this probability, this Joseph instead comes upon the house of a relative stranger, finds it for sale, and can or cannot purchase it according to the new set of probabilities then emerging. There is a cross-blending of quote-unquote effects. In this probability, Joseph's mother left little in financial terms, relatively speaking, and underlined her house was sold. The family did not get it. Give me a moment. I require more tea. Lover's triangle. Yep, sounds like that's what it was. Humorously, now, all probabilities are related. Joseph's mother is dead, in your terms, and aware to some extent of the nature of her own reality beyond the physical. She is able, again to some extent, to follow through with her own probable existences. That is, she is conscious of her own being outside of the official framework. Footnote. In his preface, Seth discusses the relationship between my mother's death and his beginning unknown reality. In sessions 679 through 80, some of my mother's probable lives, and in session 683, my contacts with her in the dream state. See the appropriate notes for each session. End of footnote. Her own psychology and characteristic methods of behavior are still hers, however, and operate so that quote-unquote she, quote-unquote, tunes into those areas of probabilities that concern her own desires and interests. In underlined this system, she wanted Joseph to have her own house. See note 1. But for many reasons that did not develop. Pause. It was, then, at her behest to some strong degree that Joseph happened upon the Markle house in question, felt that he did indeed want it, and took the steps that he did in underlined his reality. Her eyes dark, Jane held up her empty glass. Keep him in trance. She had been sipping beer. Now she sat quietly waiting while I got another bottle from the refrigerator. Do you want to rest your fingers? No. If your mother did not get the man and the wealth, then, to underline her way of thinking now, underlined you can still get the house that she fantasized was her own during her life. I had to laugh a bit, for Seth's description of my mother's thinking processes was so very characteristic of her. She often dreamed of living in it. On a mental level and an emotional one, she used that probability in this life to enrich her own hours through daydreaming, but without, of course, any realization that those daydreams had their own reality. Even now, she wants Joseph to have a finer home than either of his brothers has. Emphatically and amused. You can cut that if you want. New paragraph. This is, however, a clear case of the interweaving of probabilities. In this one, Joseph can choose whether to buy or not, so there is no coercion by Stella Butts, for example. Joseph and Rupert were also shown a second house in Sayre, once a good deal cheaper, but generally much like the one in which Joseph's mother lived in this life. They saw both houses on the same day. The second, like the first, was for sale because of age. An elderly couple recently moved from the second house to a home for the aged. Again, the quote-unquote official mind says, coincidence. All of this is quite natural. Many homes underlined are for sale because the elderly can care for them no longer. Pause at 10:33. The second house had no garage and was not in as fashionable a neighborhood, but it had its own elegance. It made Rupert, now, laugh, with its odd nooks and crannies. Give us a moment. That house did not have the weight of Stella's intent upon it, yet it was also a house that she had noticed, thinking it more grand than her own, one in which she could have been happy. It was underlined her second choice. Footnote. I'd say that Seth's statement here, it was her second choice, calls for careful interpretation. Its possible implications escaped me during the session. Otherwise, I could have asked for some clarification then. Since I neglected to do so, I ended up rewriting this note a year later. End of footnote. The real estate couple, the Johnsons, were also connected. Again, the official mind says that it was a coincidence that this couple were, in their way, artistically inclined, enjoyed painting and writing, freelanced, and still lived in an apartment after some years of marriage, and that the man was underlined relatively quiet in contrast to the woman, with amusement. Yet again, probabilities merge, for the woman could well have been a underlined writer, the man an artist, and seeing Rupert and Joseph, they related with other probabilities inherent in their own natures. The intent that Joseph's mother had lives beyond the grave in those terms. No, that's not how that sentence is meant to be read. I'm so confused for a moment. This is how it is meant to be read. The intent that Joseph's mother had lives beyond the grave in those terms. She still wants Joseph to have a house, and one that will be more fashionable and wealthy than her own. Now, Mr. Markle, a wealthy businessman, also had strong artistic abilities. He was a dealer in precious stones and fine antiquities. These qualities attracted Joseph's mother, Stella, and with the situation as she set it up in that life, she was impressed, knowing that the man's talents would bring him wealth. His artistic leanings caused him to choose real estate people who had latent artistic abilities of their own. Give us a moment. Jane, as Seth, took the time to light a cigarette. As the two couples talked, it turned out that there were other quote-unquote coincidences. Rupert and Joseph had recently thought of taking a weekend vacation at a particular resort motel, within the general area but not especially close by. This real estate couple had been forced to spend a night at the same resort due to poor weather, at a time when a psychic was featured as an entertainer. This psychic startled the couple by correctly identifying some specific elements of their experiences, so there was some kind of psychic connection also. Again, of course, coincidence. So says the officially organized mind. The rich interweavings of probabilities are apparent in all of your lives if only you stop organizing your perceptions and experience in prepackaged ways. Emphatically. The many directions possible for the species exist now. Joseph reacted on a cellular level in one respect. The cells recognized the probable reality involved, and he, Joseph, felt that he was, quote-unquote, at home in the marketplace, and yet consciously could not explain the feeling. Footnote. See session 684 through 85 in section 1. End of footnote. In certain terms, his mother will feel vindicated if Joseph buys that house, but the choice is still his and Rupert's. If you pay more attention to what you think of as coincidences, you will discover another kind of order that underlies the recognized order you follow. This has all kinds of implications biologically as far as the species is concerned. You can perhaps understand, then, that there are also probable histories beneath your lives, individually and en masse. Diving into the reality behind so-called coincidences. I see stuff like that all the time. All the time. So-called coincidences and synchronicities and all of that. Like, seems like the universe speaks to me and through me, or speaks speaks through those coincidences to me. And I just think to myself, yeah, I can imagine in other probabilities, other probable realities, I'm living a different kind of life, many different kinds of lives. In fact, I can tell you guys one thing that I really highly suspect is that in another probable reality, or perhaps many probable realities, since this is something I've so often felt very drawn to, I am not this kind of YouTuber, but instead, well, it's hard to say what kind I would be, but one who's more like sort of mainstream, like probably still, I don't know, weird and different in the way that I am, but like one who's more mainstream and one who is more of an entertainer as opposed to an educator. Because, well, it would be a lot to get into to explain why I believe that, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, sometimes I wonder if I was like meant to go down that path, but somehow I went down this one. But oh well. You heard that? You heard my beverage warmer clicking off, I suppose. It must have been what it was. Yeah, it's heating up my tea just a little bit too much, so I had to turn it off. All right, let's see. The neurologically unrecognized orders underlined can show themselves once you recognize their reality. They can sense your, or what the hell am I saying? Then your sense data will begin to confirm what has not been confirmed thus far. Take your break. Smiling. I have mercy on your fingers. 10:58. I feel funny, Jane said. Her trance had been very deep, her delivery rather fast for the most part. She inhaled repeatedly now, as though taking in extra air. I was really out. He could have kept me under for 4 hours. She explained that just before the session began, she'd received glimmerings of the material to come, but hadn't had time to tell me about it. Certainly neither of us had expected Seth to go into the affair involving the two houses in Sayre. We haven't talked a great deal about the probable ramifications inherent in the whole house episode. Rather, we expected such concepts to operate if the Seth material has any validity. Our ways of thinking have changed considerably since these sessions began over a decade ago. Every so often, Jane and I remind ourselves of just how much of a change there has been for each of us. This helps us relate our individual worlds to those of others. Neither of us believes in chance or coincidence in usual terms, for instance, nor have we since Seth began discussing the elements behind such qualities some years ago. We always assign reasons, even if they're hidden at times, for any action. Brackets, and often, we've discovered, further observation will bear out those reasons. This way of thinking led to our taking the chain of circumstances involving the two houses almost for granted. Each unfolding had seemed to fall so effortlessly into place that deep questioning hadn't been called for. Quote, "Oh, of course, things would work out that way," end quote. As of now, we think it unlikely that we'll buy either of the houses. We haven't asked Seth what to do, and do not plan to. There are more quote-unquote coincidences involved than those Seth described tonight, none of them consciously known to Jane and me before the Sayre adventure. Mr. Markle is in a nursing home but a few miles from where we live in Elmira, and my mother spent her last days in a similar home less than 15 miles away. One of Mr. Markle's children lives in Elmira and is connected with a store Jane and I have visited. Mr. Johnson, of the real estate couple that conducted us about in Sayre, did sign painting and truck lettering as a younger man, as I did. Okay, I did not read that with the right emphasis. It's supposed to say, did sign painting and truck lettering as a younger man, as I did. He and I had several mutual acquaintances in Sayre, among them an older artist of some reputation, and now deceased, that we had known in our high school days, and so forth. Then Seth went into another quote-unquote house connection after break ended at 11:24. The tea is complete. Give us a moment. The apartment house in which Rupert and Joseph presently reside has a shared driveway. In certain terms, it is the connection, the symbol between the two probability systems, for Mr. Markle's house also has a shared drive. Rupert and Joseph live in double apartments, in a large old mansion redone into such quarters. The driveway is shared with a very wealthy family next door, in which the same size house is a home to one family. Joseph's mother wanted Joseph to be very wealthy. The drive symbolically connects the two realities and is a point where the two merge. Give us a moment. Pause at 11:28. This was the end of book dictation. As we had requested that he do just before the session, Seth directed his final delivery to some other material for Jane and me. He finished at exactly midnight. A note. Since the next session was held before I was through typing this one from my notes, I can add that in the 694th session, Seth deals with some of the obvious questions we had about my mother's role in our house affairs. And that is the end of that session. So next time we'll resume with session 694. And let's see, that will be about life after death and probabilities. Sounds delicious. All right, so well, as always, I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you, Lumen, especially for lighting up the chat and being here virtually the entire time. Yeah, I know I said I feel like I can come back later, but knowing my body, as soon as I make and eat dinner, I'll be so tired that either I'll have to go to bed or I just won't be able to come back on. But that said, if by some crazy possibility I have enough energy, I'll probably come back tonight. But don't get your hopes up. Good night. Thank you very much. Good night to you as well. And you're very welcome. Thank you. Let's see, was anything else I wanted to say? Right. If I'm not back tonight, I'll just say I will most likely be back on Wednesday as usual. Probably do some live tarot readings that day, or maybe another paranormal theme stream, maybe both. I don't know yet. Then I'll come back on Saturday. Don't know with what yet, if we'll go back to another tarot card analysis or something else. And then Monday, as usual, with another Seth stream. At least that's my goal. Recently, things have been a bit difficult at times. My getting exhausted, my sleep schedule being messed up, so I wasn't able to stream. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. But don't worry, if it does, I'm not dead. I'm all right, just probably really tired. But if I'm able to, I will be back on Wednesday, Saturday, and Monday, as always. So thanks again, and have a great night, and pay attention to those strange so-called coincidences and synchronicities, because they just might be trying to tell you about your own existences in other probable realities. Take care. Hope your heart is good. Thank you so much, Lumen. I appreciate that. Yeah, my heart's been quite good for the most part as of late. It seems to be getting better overall. I guess we'll really know, though, once we get the test results. But yeah, seems like as long as I just keep taking it easier, it's getting better. So thank you for that. And with that, I bid you all farewell, and I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.